close your eyes and let the world fall silent. Imagine wandering through the narrow streets of ancient Rome, where oil lamps flicker against stone walls and footsteps echo in the midnight dusk. Somewhere beneath the city's grandeur, hidden below taverns and temples, a small flame trembles in the dark. It belongs to a woman whose name history forgot yet, whose breath still lingers in the air of every ancient ruin. Tonight we walk beside her, not to judge, but to listen to the quiet heartbeat of a life that glowed softly beneath the weight of an empire. The story drifts quietly from the hum of the present into the slow rhythm of the past. Imagine the air thick with the scent of old wine, olive oil, and smoke. The night is young, but in a cramped cellar beneath a Roman tavern, the day has already begun. You open your eyes, if only in imagination, and find yourself inside a room so small that your elbows nearly brush the walls when you breathe.
The ceiling is low, the stones cold, and yet somewhere near the floor a tiny flame dances within a clay lamp. That little flame is life itself. She wakes not from rest, but from exhaustion's brief mercy. Her name is lost to time, as if the world never thought to keep it. To us, she is simply the woman beneath Rome. The straw beneath her smells faintly of wine and smoke of many nights lived too quickly. Around her everything seems still, except the whisper of her breath and the faint creak of wood above her, where laughter and footsteps belong to another world. She sits up slowly, brushing the dust from her arm. There is no window here, no sunlight to greet her. Morning for her is when the oil in the lamp burns low. She checks, it refills it carefully, her only ritual, her only prayer. In that small act of tending the flame, she reminds herself that light, however small, must be kept alive. Her possessions could fit in one hand: a comb with missing teeth, a bronze mirror chipped at the corner, a small pot of rouge, and a folded piece of linen she guards as though it were silk. These are her treasures, the last traces of dignity allowed to a woman whose world fits between four walls. The air trembles faintly with sound. Someone upstairs laughs, another shouts, and a mug hits the table. She listens the way a sailor listens to the sea, gauging the rhythm of fortune by sound. She has learned to survive by reading noise. When the tavern grows louder, she knows the night will be long. When it quiets too soon, she fears hunger more than sleep. And yet in this narrow space, she creates her own world. She smooths her hair, rubs a touch of perfume onto her wrists, cheap oil, sharp and sweet. There is no luxury here, but there is ceremony. She leans toward her mirror, tracing a line of kohl beneath tired eyes. It is not vanity, it is armor. In a city that celebrates marble gods and forgets its living women, she builds her own temple out of reflection and resolve. If you listen closely, you can almost hear her whisper, "Today, I will not disappear." Outside Rome breathes in layers. The senators' debates echo through marble halls, merchants haggle over figs in the market, and somewhere by the fountain, a philosopher complains about morality. But below all of it, the true Rome hums in cellars like this one, where warmth, labor, and longing weave together into something the historians rarely mention. She rises, wrapping herself in a worn cloak that once was white. Its edges are frayed, but she folds it with the care of a noblewoman dressing for a feast. The world above may judge her, but down here she is sovereign over her silence. Her every motion carries grace born from necessity. When the knock comes, it is never gentle. She hesitates, glancing once more at her lamp. The flame flickers, casting her shadow large and uncertain on the wall. That shadow seems almost to breathe two women in one room, one who must survive, and one who still dreams. There are moments rare and private when she lifts her eyes toward the ceiling and imagines the sky beyond it. Does she remember the countryside she came from? The scent of grass before the city swallowed her name. Perhaps. Or perhaps she only remembers the sound of freedom, a sound she now hears only in memory, like a lullaby forgotten by the tongue, but not by the soul. She opens the door. A sliver of light slices the dark, thin, and cold. A man's voice fills the space. A few coins clink against the stone. Business. She forces a smile, a professional one, practiced and hollow. The curtain falls back and the lamp trembles once more. Time drips here like wax. Hours stretch, dissolve, and return again. The city above celebrates its gods, while below another kind of devotion continues, one not sung in temples, but whispered into the night, the devotion of surviving another day. When the voices fade and the footsteps retreat, she remains. The lamp burns low again. She sits beside it, fingers tracing the clay rim, as though it were a sacred relic. She does not pray aloud. Perhaps she no longer believes anyone listens. Yet in her stillness, there is a kind of prayer, the kind that asks for nothing but endurance. Outside, dawn begins its slow crawl through the streets of Rome. The sky blushes faintly, though she will not see it. Still, a warmth creeps into the stones, and she feels it through the floor. She closes her eyes, leaning against the wall. For a brief moment, she imagines that the warmth belongs to her, that somewhere in another life, she is waking not to labor but to sunlight. The flame flickers once, twice, then steadies. She exhales. There is peace, fragile but real. And so the night of ancient Rome fades into the memory of smoke, the scent of oil, and the courage of a woman whose name history lost but whose light endures. If you've found comfort in her quiet world, if her small flame stirred something gentle in your heart, then I invite you to stay a while longer. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, where forgotten voices still speak softly through time, and where every night another little light begins to glow. The lamp beneath Rome burned through the night, its small light quivering like a heartbeat in the dark. Above the city awoke to the sound of carts and sandals scraping stone. Somewhere the woman who once sat beside that lamp now steps out from the cellar into the cold breath of morning. The streets of Rome shimmer faintly in the first sunlight, gold spilling over marble and dust. And there, amid the temples, the markets, the laughter, and the judgment, walk the women of the toga bright against a city that pretends not to see them. The streets of Rome in the morning were a symphony of contradictions. Incense smoke from the temples, the sharp tang of olives in the market, the echo of sandals striking the stones, still damp with dew. Among the flow of people, merchants, slaves, senators, moved a procession of women, cloaked in colors Rome would rather forget. They wore togas, not the dignified draped whites of senators, but shorter, vivid versions, reds, saffrons, deep blues that caught the light like spilled wine. In Rome, such garments spoke louder than words. They said, "I am available. I am not a matron. I am what the law calls meretrix." Each woman moved differently. Some bowled their laughter loud enough to challenge the whispers that followed. Others walked quietly, eyes down, letting their colors do the speaking. Their beauty was not uniform. It was painted powdered, manufactured with the patience of survival. Chalk on the cheeks, rouge on the lips, a trace of charcoal beneath the eyes. Every mark was a defense against invisibility. One woman paused beside a public fountain, leaning to see her reflection ripple across the water. The fountain itself was crowded, children splashing, a merchant washing fruit, a man cleaning his sandals. She splashed water on her neck, gasping at the chill. Her reflection wavered, then steadied a pale face framed by hair dyed golden, the shade once reserved for goddesses, and now imported from Gaul in wigs. In that brief moment, the goddess and the woman shared the same face. Nearby, another adjusted her earrings, bronze, not gold, but polished to a deceptive gleam. They clinked softly as she turned, scanning the crowd for familiar eyes. Each gesture, each glance was part of a silent performance. This was marketing before there were scrolls, or signs branding before there were coins stamped with faces. Above them, the city pretended to look elsewhere. The senators who condemned them at midday would send their servants to summon them at night. The matrons who crossed the street in disgust were often draped in perfumes that cost more than a lifetime of a working woman's wage. The hypocrisy was the air itself, heavy, invisible, and impossible to escape. Still within that contradiction, the women built their own kind of freedom. No one praised them, but no one owned them either. They navigated alleys and courtyards with the certainty of those who know that survival is an art. They had names like Thais, Syrah, Livia, names written on walls, whispered in taverns, carved by hands that wanted to remember pleasure, but not humanity. In one such alley, where the smell of wine mixed with the dust of broken amphora, a woman named Maritima waited. Her toga was crimson, her perfume cheap, her spirit unbroken. The morning sun touched her hair, turning it into fire. Behind her, on a plaster wall, someone had scratched a message, "Maritima gives joy worth every coin." It wasn't a slur, it was advertising, and perhaps the closest thing to immortality she would ever have. As the day unfolded, the rhythm of the city pressed forward. Donkeys brayed, bread sellers shouted. A group of soldiers passed, their armor glinting. One slowed his step, tossing her a grin too practiced to mean anything. She smiled back, not because she wanted to, but because smiles were currency. A well-timed glance could mean food tonight instead of hunger. When the soldiers were gone, she exhaled, leaning against the wall. A friend approached a dark-haired woman with sharp eyes and laughter that could cut through marble. "Morning, Maritima," she said, handing over a fig. "You look like you fought Jupiter himself." "I'd win if he paid up front," Maritima replied, biting into the fruit. They laughed softly, conspirators in the art of endurance. Their laughter wasn't joy. It was armor polished daily. Later, as the sun climbed, the women drifted toward the baths. Not for leisure. Rome's public baths were the city's gossip halls, markets of flesh and rumor. Steam rose in columns, wrapping the marble pillars in ghostly veils. Inside they washed quickly, scraping away sweat and smoke with bronze strigils. Their laughter echoed off the stone, mingling with the chatter of merchants and philosophers pretending not to notice them. For a moment, they were simply bodies among bodies, equal in the blur of steam. One woman, perhaps the same who had woken beneath the tavern lamp, lingered longer in the heat. She closed her eyes and imagined it was not steam, but clouds. Not the bathhouse, but heaven. She whispered to Venus, not for love, but for luck. Her voice, barely a breath, was swallowed by the hiss of water. Outside, as the sun began to lower, the women prepared again for the evening. They painted their lips red with crushed pigment-tied ribbons around their arms and walked back into the maze of Rome. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from a tavern, the kind that made people forget their troubles long enough to find new ones. As night fell, torches lit the streets with a flickering glow that turned everything gold and uncertain. The women's bright togas shimmered like scattered embers. They became part of the city's heartbeat, unacknowledged, unending, necessary. If you listen close enough, you can almost hear the rhythm of their steps, the murmured exchanges, the laughter that hides fatigue, the soft sighs of women who have learned to live without illusions. And yet within that noise there is beauty, not the kind found in statues or temples, but in motion, resilience, and the simple will to keep walking. As the moon climbed higher, the city quieted, but their stories continued in whispers on the walls, in the scent of cheap perfume carried by the wind, in the eternal glow of lamps that burned long after the revelers slept. Their world was not built for peace, but they created moments of it. Their hearts, though bruised, still beat in time with the distant song of the Tiber River. And in that rhythm they found what Rome denied them, something close to grace. If tonight's journey through the ancient streets of Rome has warmed your imagination, if these forgotten women have stirred your heart even gently, I invite you to linger with us. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, and together we'll keep walking softly through time where the lamplight never dies and every story becomes a lullaby. As night sank over the city, the laughter of the taverns dimmed and the bright togas faded into shadow. The women disappeared one by one into the winding streets, leaving behind only their scent of oil and smoke. Rome grew quiet, yet even in silence the city spoke. Its walls, worn smooth by centuries of touch and longing, still carried the voices of those who had lived, loved, and endured within them. If one listened closely enough, those ancient stones would begin to whisper their stories etched by hands that refused to be forgotten. The streets of ancient Rome slept restlessly. The air was cool but not clean. It smelled of ashes, olives, and rain that never quite reached the ground. Torches flickered along the narrow alleys, throwing shadows that seemed to move on their own. And on those walls, cracked, stained, and endlessly rewritten, there were words. Faint scratches, deep carvings, charcoal smudges. Together they form the heartbeat of a city too alive to ever be silent. By daylight, the people of Rome hurried past them. To the senators they were vandalism, to the priests sin, to the philosophers proof of moral decay. But at night when the market slept and the fountains stopped singing, the graffiti glowed faintly in the lamplight like confessions written to the gods themselves. One name appeared more than the rest, Maritima. The woman in the crimson toga who laughed too loudly and carried the scent of cheap perfume mixed with sea salt. Her name had been carved by many hands, some in gratitude, some in longing, some in spite. Maritima gives joy worth every coin. Read one scrawl, uneven and sincere. Another harsher Maritima stole my heart and my sandals, and another smaller, still barely visible. Maritima, forgive me. Each word was a pulse of memory, left behind by those who sought comfort or redemption, or simply someone to remember their existence. In the stillness of early dawn, a young slave boy passed through the alley with a bucket of water scrubbing one section of wall clean. The city demanded constant purification, its officials afraid that even words could corrupt. But when he stepped back, new messages already shimmered faintly under the surface carved too deep to erase. Rome could wash away paint and blood, but not the human need to speak. Above, in the narrow window of a tavern, Maritima stirred awake. Her night had been long, her laughter forced her body tired. Yet before sleep claimed her, she always looked at that wall. It was her mirror, the only reflection the city allowed her. In those etched letters, she was alive known and strangely eternal. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The street was nearly empty, just a few merchants setting up stalls, their breath visible in the cold air. She walked slowly, fingertips tracing the carvings on the wall. Her fingers found her own name rough beneath her touch. It wasn't beauty that moved her, it was survival. If they write my name, she whispered, then I still exist. A gust of wind swept through the alley, carrying with it the faint murmur of prayers from a nearby temple. She closed her eyes, listening. Perhaps the gods did hear her after all, not through temples of marble, but through walls that had absorbed the warmth of 1,000 forgotten lives. Not far away, another wall bore different words, insults, jokes, and pleas. One man had written a complaint about his landlord. Another confessed love for a woman he would never have. There were crude drawings, faded hearts, and stick figures dancing beside obscenities. To the historian, these were trivial. To the city, they were soul marks, the proof that even in a world ruled by emperors, ordinary people still found ways to leave traces of themselves. A scribe once said that Rome was built on words, laws, decrees, speeches. But the truer Rome, the one that pulsed beneath politics, was built on whispers carved in stone. The graffiti spoke not of conquest, but of loneliness, not of empire, but of desire. As Maritima walked, the light grew stronger, spilling down the walls like liquid gold. The words seemed to come alive. She read fragments aloud, her voice a soft echo. Felix was here. I miss my mother. Don't forget me. The words blurred together until they no longer belonged to anyone. They became a single plea from humanity itself. Remember us. She stopped beside a corner where the plaster was peeling away, revealing older layers beneath. Each layer told a story, centuries upon centuries of lives, stacked like sediment. There were names in Greek curses, in Latin prayers, in broken letters. Time had tried to bury them, but the walls still breathed. They remembered everything. Maritima smiled faintly. You keep our secrets, she said to the stones, better than the priests ever could. The city began to stir again. Vendors shouted. Children ran. The rhythm of Rome returned. But for those who paused long enough to look, the walls still spoke. A soldier might glance up and see his own words from years ago carved before he left for war. A baker might notice his wife's name faded, but still there scratched during the year of famine. A woman might pass and see her own past staring back at her in uneven letters. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted everything in bronze, Maritima sat near the same wall once more. The air was warm, the scent of roasting grain drifting from the bakery nearby. She took a piece of charcoal from her pouch, blackened from the tavern's lamps, and pressed it against the plaster. For a moment she hesitated. Then slowly she wrote, "We are still here." Her handwriting was not graceful, but it was steady. She smiled as she blew gently on the letters, fixing them into history. No emperor would record her name. No poet would sing of her, but this she could leave behind. A small act of defiance, a message to the future. When she stood, the evening wind tugged at her cloak. The words shimmered briefly in the fading light before melting into shadow. Yet somehow they remained. And in centuries to come, when archaeologists brushed dust from ancient walls, they would find her message. They would whisper it aloud and wonder who she was. And in that whisper, she would live again. For every empire that rose and fell, the walls endured. They were the memory of those Rome forgot: the women, the slaves, the dreamers. The walls had no eyes, no ears, and yet they had seen more than any god. They remembered laughter, betrayal, and the weight of survival. They remembered Maritima. As night returned, torches were lit, casting the alley in warm, trembling light. The words on the wall flickered, as though they too were breathing. Rome would sleep again, and tomorrow someone new would write upon these stones. The conversation would never end. If you listen carefully, even now you can still hear it, the quiet scratching of history, speaking through stone, whispering, "We are still here." When the walls of Rome fell silent again, their carvings fading into the soft glow of lamplight, the city seemed to breathe out a long sigh. The echoes of laughter, curses, and longing sank beneath the hum of night. Somewhere near the heart of the city, beyond the market and the taverns, smoke drifted gently upward from a small temple crowned with doves. Inside, where marble met moonlight, the air shimmered with the scent of myrrh and rose oil. The women who had lived in shadow now came here in quiet procession, not to work, not to survive, but to pray. And among them walked Maritima. The Temple of Venus stood at the edge of the forum, not far from the hum of the crowd, but wrapped in its own kind of silence. Its columns were streaked with the marks of time fingerprints of centuries' wind and prayer. Between them hung garlands of fading flowers, their fragrance softened by the smoke that rose in curling ribbons from bronze bowls. In this sanctuary, where marble goddesses smiled with unblinking calm, the forgotten women of Rome found a place to breathe. Maritima entered barefoot, the stone cool against her skin. Around her, other women moved softly, their bright togas muted by the half-light. Some carried offerings, small coins, combs, or mirrors. Others simply brought their tears. None spoke above a whisper. It was not shame that silenced them, but reverence and perhaps a fragile hope that the goddess might hear a prayer no one else would accept. At the center of the temple stood the statue of Venus. Ivory skin, golden hair, lips curved in eternal invitation.
Once Maritima had hated that face. It was too perfect, too distant. But tonight, as she watched the candlelight play across its surface, she felt something different. The goddess did not mock her. She seemed almost human, carved not from stone, but from memory of every woman who had ever loved, endured, and been judged for both. Maritima approached slowly. In her hands she held a tiny bowl of oil, the last of her perfume saved for this offering. Kneeling, she poured it at the base of the statue. The scent rose sweet and sharp, cutting through the heavy air. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer not for wealth or beauty, but for peace. "If you can hear me," she murmured, "grant me the courage to still believe in kindness."
Her words disappeared into the incense smoke. Yet, as the oil burned, a soft light trembled across the statue's face, as though Venus herself had sighed. Behind her, another woman began to sing a low, haunting melody in an ancient tongue. It wound through the air like a thread of gold, fragile and luminous. Others joined in their voices, rising and falling like waves. The song was not about love, as the poets told it. It was about endurance, the kind of love that survives without reward. Maritima felt her heart loosen. The weight she carried, heavy as the city above, seemed to lift for a moment. Around her, the women sang of sea foam and birth of beauty that defies ruin, of the fire that cannot be extinguished, even when the world forgets your name. She looked at them, faces lined by toil hands, scarred from work and thought. We are all daughters of Venus, though no one will ever write it that way. Outside, thunder grumbled faintly over the hills. Rain began to fall in soft whispers, tapping the roof tiles of the temple. It was a rare mercy in the heart of Rome's summer. The women continued to sing, their voices mingling with the rhythm of rain. The sound filled the chamber like a blessing. For a fleeting moment, the boundaries between goddess and mortal blurred. The scent of incense became the breath of prayer. The flicker of lamps became the beating of hearts. Venus was no longer a statue, but a presence warm, unseen, and impossibly near. When the singing ended, silence returned, not empty but alive. The women lingered, unwilling to let go of the stillness they had found. Some touched the cold marble of the altar. Others exchanged glances that said what words could not. "We are not alone." Maritima remained kneeling long after the others left. The oil had burned down to a faint glow, the air thick with the smell of smoke and roses. She thought of her name scratched on a wall of the men who had carved it, of the nights that blurred together into survival. And she thought of this moment, this quiet proof that even in the lowest places the sacred could be found. She rose, smoothing her cloak, and turned toward the doorway. Outside, the rain had deepened, washing dust from the streets. The torches hissed and sputtered in the downpour, but their light endured. She stepped out beneath the storm, lifting her face to the sky. Cool drops struck her cheeks like tears she no longer needed to shed. The city that had judged her seemed gentler in the rain. The marble gleamed, the alleys shimmered. Even the graffiti on the walls looked cleaner, reborn. She imagined the goddess walking beside her barefoot too, her golden hair wet, her laughter mingling with thunder. In that moment, Maritima did not feel small. She was part of something larger, something ancient and forgiving. She was one among countless women who had walked this earth carrying light within them, even as the world turned away. The goddess did not live in the sky or in statues. She lived in every act of courage, every whispered prayer, every hand that chose to comfort instead of harm. As she crossed the square, a child ran past her, splashing through puddles. He looked up and smiled, a tooth-missing joy uncontained. Maritima smiled back. The rain had softened. Her hair wiped away her makeup, left her raw and real. For the first time in years, she felt beautiful. Later, when she returned to her small room, the scent of incense clung to her like a secret. She relit her oil lamp, watching its golden flame bloom once more. It burned steadily, its smoke rising in slow, graceful curls, just like the offering she had left before the goddess. Outside, the rain continued to fall, whispering against the roof. The city slept unaware that in a cellar below its grand streets, a woman had found her peace. And though her name might fade from walls and memory, the light she carried would not. For in every age, there is someone like her, a soul, who lights a flame in darkness, who kneels before the unknown, and dares to believe that love in all its forms is holy.
When the rain at last ceased, the city awoke to the scent of washed stone and the faint perfume of roses that had drifted from the temple. The offerings to Venus had burned away, leaving only smoke stains on the altar and a lingering warmth in the hearts of those who had prayed there. Maritima walked home beneath a silver dawn, her hair still damp, her spirit quieter than it had been in years. Yet as the streets dried and the day began again, she could feel the weight of the world settling once more upon her shoulders. In Rome, peace was always borrowed, never owned.
The sun rose slowly over the 7 hills, painting the rooftops gold, but the alleys below remained cold. Maritima sat beside her oil lamp, the flame dancing faintly against the walls of her small room. Its glow no longer comforted her as it once had. It flickered too easily now, burning faster with each night, as if it too were growing weary. She watched the light tremble and thought of herself alive, yes, but always fading. Outside, the street stirred, the cry of vendors, the rattle of carts, the laughter of men already drunk. It all returned like the tide. The world demanded her presence again. She rose, wrapped her worn cloak around her, and stepped into the morning air. The stone beneath her feet was slick from the rain, and the scent of wet earth mingled with smoke from bakeries just beginning to light their ovens. It should have felt alive, but it only reminded her how far she was from freedom. The day unfolded like countless others. A few kind faces, a few cruel ones, coins that never seemed to add up. By noon, she found herself near the fountain in the market square, where the marble statues gleamed with new brightness after the storm. Children played at its edge, splashing one another, their laughter echoing like music from another world. She watched them for a long time, smiling faintly, until the sight of a mother drawing her child close reminded her of everything she had lost, or perhaps everything she had never been allowed to have. She turned away. The air was heavy again, thick with the scent of sweat and wine. Rome was a city that devoured its poor and forgot their names before dusk. Still, there were small mercies. A baker's apprentice offered her a crust of bread. A stray dog followed her for several streets, tail wagging before disappearing into an alley. And once in the shadow of a temple, a soldier bowed his head as she passed, not in mockery, but in recognition. These moments were brief, but they were enough to remind her that beneath all the cruelty, there still existed traces of kindness faint as the glow of her lamp. That evening she returned to the place where the walls spoke, the alley filled with old graffiti layered like pages of a forgotten book. She traced her name again, though the rain had blurred it into the plaster. The words were fading, melting back into the stone. For a long time she stood there, uncertain whether she should rewrite them or let them vanish. To be remembered was a kind of immortality, but to disappear was peace. She closed her eyes. Around her the city murmured with the same restless rhythm, carts rolling, voices shouting, footsteps echoing. Life went on indifferent. And yet, in that indifference, she found something strangely holy. The gods had not answered her prayers, but the world had still given her moments of light, even if they burned too quickly. Later in her small room, she sat before the lamp once more. The oil was nearly gone. She knew she could not afford more for several days. Carefully, she tilted the lamp to keep the wick wet. The flame leaned to one side, stretched thin, and steadied again. She watched it as though it were her own heartbeat, fragile, but enduring. In its shimmer, she saw the faces of the women she had prayed beside in the temple, their voices rising in song to a goddess who might have been listening. She imagined Venus not as a marble statue, but as a woman like them, tired, misunderstood, yet still radiant in her defiance. Her thoughts drifted toward the future. What would become of her when the flame went out? Would the city notice? Would the walls remember? Or would she simply fade into the same silence that swallowed all who lived too close to the ground? Perhaps that was enough to have lived to have left even one trace behind. The world, she thought, is built not on emperors and temples, but on hands. Like hers, hands that worked, comforted, and lit small fires against the dark. The night deepened. Outside, thunder rolled once more, distant this time, like a memory returning to say goodbye. She smiled faintly, as though the gods were reminding her that they too remembered. With slow, deliberate movements, she fed the flame one last drop of oil. The light brightened for a heartbeat, painting her face in gold before it began to shrink again. She whispered a final prayer, not for mercy, but for meaning. "Let this light," she said softly, "find its way into another's hands." The lamp flickered. The shadows swayed, and for a moment, the room looked almost beautiful. She lay down beside it, her head resting against the cool wall. The faint warmth of the lamp reached her cheek, and she closed her eyes. The air hummed softly, filled with the pulse of distant footsteps and the sigh of the city. Then the flame trembled once more, once twice, and went out. But the darkness that followed was not cruel. It was gentle quiet and full of memory. Somewhere beyond the stars shone over Rome countless tiny lights burning in the heavens, mirroring the small flames that had burned in its streets. Maritima's lamp was gone, but its glow lingered in the walls that remembered her name in the hearts of women who still prayed to Venus in the air itself. The world had lost her voice, yet her story remained woven into the fabric of a city that never truly sleeps. And though she would never know it centuries later, someone would uncover that same street brush, the dust from the plaster, and find her faint inscription, "We are still here." Her wish had been answered in the quietest way. So ended the night of the woman beneath Rome. Her light did not die. It simply joined the endless constellation of human endurance. And from that soft darkness, a new world began to stir. One far to the north, where the air was colder, and the fires burned differently. The echoes of her courage would travel there, carried by time, and by the memory of all who ever fought to keep a flame alive. When the flame beneath Rome faded into silence, its last curl of smoke rose toward the heavens like a prayer. Centuries passed, empires fell, and the dust of the city settled into the bones of the earth. Yet somewhere far to the north, in a world of frost and breath made visible, that same spark found new hands to hold it. The light was no longer trapped in oil or marble. It burned now in the hearths of wooden homes, in the eyes of those who healed with the gifts of nature. And so the story drifts from the marble heart of Rome to the wild heart of the north, where a healer wakes beneath the mist. The morning rose pale and quiet over the fjords. Mist clung to the ground like a living thing, curling around the stones and the roots of birch trees. A single raven called across the valley, its echo fading into the mountains. In the center of this stillness, a small hut stood near a stream that whispered to itself among the reeds. From its chimney drifted a thin line of smoke, soft gray and fragrant with herbs. Inside, the healer was already awake. Her name was Astrid. The villagers called her Leknir, the one who listens to the earth. She moved slowly, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands wrapped in wool that had known years of labor. The fire in her hearth burned low, fed by birch logs and dried moss. Beside it hung bundles of herbs, yarrow, juniper, angelica, swaying gently in the heat like pendulums marking the rhythm of her life. Astrid began her day not with words, but with silence. She believed healing began there in listening to what the wind carried, to what the river murmured, to what her own heart remembered. She knelt before the fire, and whispered a blessing in the old tongue, thanking the gods for another dawn, and asking that her hands might not fail the sick who would soon find their way to her door. The door creaked as she opened it, letting the cool mist spill into the room. Outside, the world smelled of pine and wet earth. She stepped into the grass, bare feet touching the dew. Every blade glistened with tiny beads of light, and in that quiet moment, the world felt unbroken. She gathered what the land offered, a sprig of yarrow, to stop bleeding, a root of angelica, to warm the blood, and a handful of juniper berries to purify the air. Each plant she touched, she named softly as if greeting an old friend. By the time she returned inside, the mist had thinned, revealing the first rays of sunlight breaking over the mountains. The light filled her hut, falling across wooden bowls, clay pots, and woven baskets brimming with dried herbs. She ground some yarrow leaves between her palms, their scent sharp and clean, and mixed them with honey in a small bronze mortar. The sound of the pestle tapping against the metal was steady and patient, the heartbeat of her work. A knock came at the door. Astrid looked up. It was a man from the village, his arm wrapped in cloth darkened with blood. Behind him stood his wife, pale with worry. Astrid said nothing at first. She simply gestured for them to enter, her eyes kind but focused. She cut the bandage gently away, revealing a deep gash along the man's forearm, an accident from an axe or a plow perhaps. The wound was angry red and swollen. Without hesitation, she reached for her bowl of yarrow paste. "This will bite like winter," she warned softly, and pressed it to the wound. The man flinched, but did not cry out. Astrid cleaned the cut with warm water infused with birch bark, then bound it in clean linen. As she worked, she hummed under her breath a tune with no words, only rhythm and breath, as if she were singing to the wound itself. The song carried something unseen, a power older than medicine. When she finished, the man's face had softened. He looked at her not with fear, but with a kind of quiet gratitude. "You'll mend," she said simply. "But let the arm rest, or the gods will remind you of your pride." The couple thanked her with a small pouch of barley and a carved bone charm. Payment enough. Astrid smiled and set the offerings beside the fire. When they left, she sat for a while staring into the smoke that coiled upward. Healing, she thought, was not about curing. It was about remembering the balance between pain and mercy, between body and spirit. Outside, the mist had lifted completely, revealing a landscape of green hills and distant sea. The air was filled with the cry of seabirds and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer from the village below. Astrid stepped out again, her cloak drawn tight against the wind. She followed the stream down toward the meadow where wildflowers nodded in the breeze. The ground beneath her feet was soft and living, and she could feel the pulse of the earth rising through her soles. She knelt and picked a stalk of meadow sweet, its tiny blossoms pale and sweet-scented. For pain, she murmured, tucking it into her pouch. Her fingers brushed the soil, and she smiled. The earth was generous, but it demanded respect. To take without thanks was to invite sickness of the soul. By afternoon, the sky had deepened to a luminous gray, and Astrid returned home to tend her fire. She brewed tea with angelica root, its steam filling the hut with a warm, spicy scent. She drank slowly, her thoughts wandering. Somewhere far away beyond mountains and seas, she imagined cities of marble and gold, places she had never seen. Yet even there, she believed people suffered, prayed, and sought healing. It comforted her to think that across the vastness of time and distance, the same small flame burned in every human heart. As night approached, Astrid lit a lamp made of whale oil, the flame steady against the wind. She wrote a few words on a scrap of birch bark notes about remedies, dreams, and the weather's shifting moods. Her handwriting was uneven, but her thoughts were precise. She knew that knowledge was as fragile as breath, and she wanted it to live beyond her. Before sleeping, she stepped outside one last time. The mist had returned, curling around the mountains like a veil. Stars shimmered faintly above their reflections, trembling in the water below. She whispered another prayer, not to the gods of war or wealth, but to the quiet powers that kept the world alive. The warmth of fire, the rhythm of rain, the patience of growing things. Somewhere deep within the forest, an owl called a low, haunting sound that blended with the whisper of the wind. Astrid smiled her breath, clouding the air. "The earth remembers," she said softly. "And so do I." Then she returned to her hearth, where the fire burned low but steady, and the herbs above her head swayed gently in the draught. Outside, the mist thickened again, wrapping the valley in silence. Inside, the healer closed her eyes, and the flame beside her flickered, glowing like a heartbeat, small, enduring, eternal. As Astrid slept beside her fading fire, the mist outside thickened until it seemed to swallow the moon. The valley exhaled softly, and with that breath, time began to move again. The centuries ahead would remember her not through monuments or books, but through the quiet endurance of her craft. The flame she tended, born once in Rome, and carried through memory, had now taken root in the northern soil. It lived in her herbs, her songs, and her steady hands. And now, as dawn returned to the fjords, it would spread once more through the world of plants that spoke to her like old friends. Morning came slowly in the north. The fog rolled back toward the sea, and sunlight spilled across the valley like honey. It was the kind of light that didn't rush, it arrived softly, climbing over the mountains, touching every leaf, every blade of grass, every dewdrop clinging to the wildflowers. Astrid stood at her door, the chill biting her cheeks, her breath clouding before her. Her small hut still smelled of angelica and smoke, and somewhere in the rafters a sparrow had made a nest. She whispered a greeting to the earth and began her morning rounds. A woven basket hung from her arm, its bottom lined with dried moss. The day's work, she knew, would be guided not by her will, but by what the land chose to offer. For though she was called the healer, Astrid believed herself merely a translator, someone who listened to what the plants were already saying. The first she visited was yarrow growing in clusters beside the stream. Its white flowers looked like small stars fallen into the grass. She knelt and ran her fingers along its stems. "Good morning, soldier's friend," she said softly. "You've saved more lives than the gods themselves." She cut a few stalks, careful to leave the roots undisturbed. Yarrow was her most trusted ally. It stopped bleeding, soothed wounds, and kept fever from stealing a man's strength. She remembered the story of Odin blessing the plant, with the power to close flesh and restore life. Whenever she touched it, she felt that blessing pass through her fingertips like quiet fire. Next came Angelica, tall and proud, swaying in the wind, as if listening to music only it could hear. Its hollow stalks gleamed green, its white umbels shining against the blue sky. Astrid smiled. "Ah, my strong one," she murmured. "You bring warmth where winter bites hardest." She broke a piece of the root, inhaling its sharp, clean scent. Angelica was the healer's heart. It strengthened the blood, chased away infection, and calmed the storms that brewed inside the body. Some said an angel had revealed its power to humankind. Astrid believed it. Whenever she brewed its root into tea, she whispered thanks for the mercy that still lived in the soil. Farther up the hillside, beneath the birches, grew juniper, its berries dark and fragrant. The plant's needles glistened with morning dew. Astrid gathered a handful and rolled them between her palms, releasing their sharp scent. "You keep sickness away," she said, "and drive the bad spirits with your smoke." She thought of the long winters when fever swept through the village and families burned juniper branches to cleanse their homes. The smoke curled around them like invisible armor, keeping fear at bay. For Astrid, the scent of juniper was the scent of protection, spiritual and earthly both. As she climbed higher, she found meadowsweet, its clusters of tiny white blossoms glowing in the light. She smiled tenderly. "You bring comfort to the weary," she whispered. "You ease pain without pride." The plant's fragrance filled the air, sweet, calm, steady. She knew it could cool a fever, soothe an aching body, and quiet the mind's unrest. In her own heart, meadowsweet reminded her that even gentleness could be a form of strength. When she returned to her hut, the basket overflowed with life. The plants, still fresh with dew, carried with them the scent of earth and sunlight. She spread them on her table, arranging them in small bundles to dry. The room glowed with color, the whites of yarrow and meadow sweet, the greens of juniper, the gold of angelica roots. It looked, she thought, like an altar, built not for gods, but for gratitude. She prepared her tools, a small bronze mortar, a bone pestle, and a pot of honey. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each herb had its purpose, its own song. Some she ground into powder, others she hung above the fire to dry. With every touch, she murmured blessings learned from her mother and her mother's mother before her. Their voices seemed to linger in the smoke, whispering, "Be gentle, Astrid. The earth gives, but it also listens." By midday, a child arrived at her door. His face was pale, his breath shallow. His mother followed close behind, eyes red from worry. "He has the cough again," she said, voice trembling. "He can't sleep." Astrid guided them in, setting the boy near the fire. She reached for her herbs, already knowing what to do. Meadowsweet for fever, juniper smoke for the air, and a drop of honey stirred with angelica tea. The boy drank, wincing at the bitterness. "There," Astrid whispered. "Let the warmth chase the shadows from your lungs." She placed her hand on his forehead, humming softly a tune older than words. As she sang, she felt something shift in the air.
It wasn't magic, not in the way legends described. It was simpler, quieter, the meeting of breath and will of life, recognizing life. The boy's breathing eased, his eyelids fluttered, and soon he was asleep. The mother wept relief breaking through her fear. Astrid smiled, gently touching her shoulder. "It is not me," she said. "It is the earth that heals. I only reminded it to remember him." When they left, she returned to her hearth and sat beside the flame. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. She closed her eyes and thought of the countless hands before hers. Roman women tending lamps in the dark, midwives in ancient villages, wanderers who carried seeds in their pockets like prayers. The world changed, but the rhythm did not. Fire, breath, earth, and mercy, they were one and the same. As night approached, Astrid stepped outside. The valley was bathed in silver light, the air cool and damp. She could hear the faint rush of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the hum of life all around her. The plants she had gathered seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, as if whispering their own prayers back to the sky. She whispered too, a promise carried on her breath. As long as there are hands to heal, the flame will live. Then she turned toward her hut where the fire still burned soft and golden. Its glow spilled out into the night, merging with the stars above, the same stars that once shone over Rome, over Maritima's fading lamp. The flame had found a new keeper now, and its story was far from over. The wind carried the scent of juniper smoke across the valley that night, winding through pine branches and whispering into the dreams of those who slept. Inside her small hut, Astrid stirred in her sleep, her mind still tracing the rhythm of her healing songs. But somewhere between waking and dreaming, the air around her began to shimmer. The line between the seen and unseen thinned, and the quiet voice of the land seemed to grow louder. It was calling her not with words, but with a pulse that echoed through the mist. When she opened her eyes, the world felt different. The fire still burned in her hearth, but its light seemed to reach beyond the walls towards something vast and sacred, waiting just beyond the veil of dawn. The morning broke silver and soundless. A thin fog lay over the meadow, so pale it looked as though the world had been wrapped in glass. Astrid rose slowly, her hair loose around her shoulders, the air cool against her face. There was a feeling in her chest, something heavy like an unspoken truth pressing to be heard. She went to the doorway and stood still, watching the mist curl between the birches. Somewhere within that mist, she could feel the presence of the old ones, the spirits who lived beneath the roots and inside the wind. They had come before she thought, but never this close. She gathered a bundle of dried herbs, mugwort, juniper, and yarrow, and tied them with a strip of linen. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with reverence. The time for healing today was not of the body, but of the unseen. She placed the bundle in the fire, and smoke began to rise in soft gray spirals, filling the hut with its earthy fragrance. The scent was sharp, bitter, and strangely sweet. It wrapped around her, blurring the walls, softening the edges of everything she thought she knew. Astrid sat cross-legged before the fire, her palms open to its warmth.
Her eyes closed, and the world fell away. The sound of the river faded. The crackle of the fire dissolved. There was only breath. Then, like the opening of a hidden door, she felt the shift. A warmth spread through her spine and lifted her mind beyond the limits of her body. The first image came as a flicker of light, a woman standing before a great marble city, holding a lamp against the dark. Then the image changed. A field of flowers drenched in rain, a voice singing from within a storm, and hands, always hands, lifting fire from one age to another. Astrid's breath caught. She didn't know these visions yet. They felt familiar, like memories she had inherited from the earth itself. The smoke thickened. Within it, shadows began to move, gentle figures shaped from mist. They were neither frightening nor strange. Some looked like the women she had seen at the temple in her dreams. Others were wrapped in furs, faces painted with ash and herbs. They spoke in a language older than words, yet Astrid understood. Their voices wove together like the sound of water against stone. "You are the bridge," they said, "between what was and what will be, between the wound and the healing." Astrid's heart beat fast. "I am only a healer," she whispered. "I am no priestess, no goddess." The smoke shifted, swirling like a veil. From within it, a form began to take shape. A tall woman, crowned with feathers and moonlight. Her eyes were like still water, reflecting everything and nothing. She reached out her hand, and the fire flared its color, turning pale blue. "You heal," the spirit said softly. "But not only flesh. You carry memory. The same flame that burned beneath the stones of Rome now lives in your heart. It does not belong to one woman or one place. It belongs to all who keep the light alive when the world forgets." Astrid felt tears on her cheeks. The fire's glow shimmered against them like gold. She bowed her head. "Then, teach me how to carry it well." The spirit smiled, though her face began to fade back into smoke. "Listen," she said. "Not with your ears, but with your bones. The earth will speak when the world is silent." And then she was gone. The smoke thinned, drifting toward the small window where dawn was beginning to pour in, washing the room in soft gold. Astrid sat still for a long time, her breath steady, her eyes unfocused. The fire had returned to its normal color, but something in her had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It was full, humming with unseen life. Outside, the village was waking. The faint clang of a hammer echoed from the forge, and a child's laughter floated through the trees. Astrid stepped out into the open air, the world still hazy from the last threads of smoke. Her bare feet sank into the damp earth, cool and grounding. She felt as though she had stepped between two worlds, the one she could touch, and the one that watched from behind the veil. She began to walk toward the forest's edge, her fingertips brushing the ferns that lined the path. Every leaf seemed to tremble as she passed. Every tree seemed to listen. When she reached a clearing, she stopped. A raven perched on a branch above her, its feathers gleaming like ink. It tilted its head, watching her closely. "You were in my dream," she whispered. "Do you bring me a message?" The bird croaked once, sharp and deliberate, before taking flight. It circled above her, then disappeared into the mist. Astrid smiled. "Then I will follow," she murmured, and turned toward the direction it had flown. She found herself beside a great stone, smooth and gray, half buried in moss. Strange runes had been carved into its surface, old symbols older even than her ancestors' stories. She knelt and traced them with her fingers. They felt warm beneath her touch, as if the stone itself remembered her. "You have seen it all," she said softly. "The wars, the prayers, the silence." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke, not from her hearth, but from far away. It smelled of oil dust and distant stars. She closed her eyes and saw again the woman from her vision, the Roman with the oil lamp. She wondered if her spirit had guided the flame to her across oceans of time. When Astrid opened her eyes again, the forest felt brighter. The mist had lifted entirely, revealing the vast sky stretched over the valley. It was a pale blue, threaded with clouds like strands of silver. The air was alive, every sound a reminder that life itself was sacred breath, fire, wind, water. She whispered to the sky, "The flame is safe with me." And in the gentle rustle of leaves, she thought she heard the faintest reply, "Then keep it burning." That night, Astrid built a small altar beside her fire. She placed upon it the herbs that had guided her mugwort for dreams, juniper for cleansing, and a single sprig of meadow, sweet for peace. The smoke rose again, thin and steady, curling toward the beams of her roof. She sang softly the melody, carrying through the cracks of her hut into the night air, a hymn to the invisible forces that watched over her. In that song, the flame found its voice once more. It was the same flame that had burned in the hands of Maritima, beneath Rome's stone, now reborn in the northern mists. And though Astrid did not know it, her prayer would echo far beyond her valley into the hearts of those who would one day call her not just a healer, but a seer, the keeper of the sacred smoke. That night, the sacred smoke lingered long after Astrid's song faded into silence. It wound its way through the cracks of her hut, drifted across the meadow, and vanished into the silver mist. Yet something of it remained, an invisible warmth that seemed to hum in the air, as though the earth itself had listened and remembered. When dawn came, the fog was gone, and the world glistened as if newly washed. Astrid awoke to the soft crackle of her dying fire and the faint scent of juniper still clinging to her hands. The vision had changed her, but she could not yet know how deeply. For now, she only felt the stirring of something vast and wordless, an awareness that every living thing, every breath and blade of grass was speaking to her in ways beyond sound. The morning air was crisp and clear. A soft wind whispered through the birch trees outside Astrid's hut, carrying with it the faint hum of bees and the lowing of distant cattle. The valley was awake again, alive in quiet harmony. Astrid stepped out into the light barefoot, her long wool cloak brushing against the dew-soaked grass. The world looked simple from the outside mist curling off the river smoke from cottages rising into the sky. But she knew now that beneath that calm surface was a network of breath and heartbeat connecting everything that lived. She knelt beside the stream that ran past her home and dipped her hands into the water. It was cold, clear, and alive. The current slid across her palms like silk. "You carry the stories," she whispered to the river. "The tears of the mountains, the dreams of the sea." She watched as the ripples spread outward, glinting with light, and thought of her vision. The Roman woman, the temple, the eternal flame. Somehow it was all part of the same song flowing through, centuries passing from one heart to another. When he stood, she turned her gaze toward the fields. Today she would visit the old farmstead beyond the ridge, where a family had sent word that their crops were failing. It was not unusual for people to call on her when sickness touched their land, for they believed her herbs could heal not only flesh, but soil. She packed her basket with roots and powders, tied her hair back, and began the long walk through the valley. The path wound between hills golden with late summer grass. The air smelled of salt and heather, and the sky stretched wide above her, pale and endless. As she walked, she felt the steady rhythm of the earth beneath her feet. Every step seemed to echo with meaning, as if the ground itself were whispering, "You are not alone." By the time she reached the farm, the sun was high. The fields stretched before her, brittle and gray, the stalks bending lifeless in the wind. A woman came running from the doorway of a small wooden house, her face lined with worry. "Healer," she said breathlessly, "the earth has turned against us. The seeds will not take root, and the cattle refuse to graze." Astrid placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "The earth does not turn against us," she said softly. "It simply grows tired as we do." She walked out into the field, kneeling to touch the soil. It was dry, crumbly, stripped of its spirit. She closed her eyes and pressed both palms flat against the ground. The wind quieted. The hum of bees faded. For a long time, there was only silence and then a pulse. Faint at first, then stronger. The heartbeat of the land. She felt it as clearly as her own pulse, and with it came an understanding beyond thought. The soil needed rest, not remedy. Too much had been taken without offering thanks. She opened her eyes and turned to the farmer and his wife, who stood watching her anxiously. "Your land is weary," she said. "Let it sleep for a season. Burn juniper and meadowsweet at dusk for 7 nights. Speak to it not in prayer, but in gratitude. The earth remembers kindness." They nodded, though she could see doubt flicker in their eyes. She smiled, knowing that belief, like healing, takes time. She left them with a pouch of seed, mixed with crushed yarrow and ash. "Scatter this when the spring returns," she told them. "The roots will find what they need." On her way back through the valley, Astrid paused by a stand of birch trees. Their white trunks gleamed in the sunlight, the leaves whispering in the wind. She leaned her palm against one, feeling its cool bark. "You've seen it too," she murmured. "How the people forget to listen." A gust of wind stirred the branches, and for an instant she could have sworn the trees sighed in reply. That evening she sat outside her hut, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The sky was a river of gold and fire, its reflection trembling across the stream. She thought again of her hands, the same hands that had gathered herbs, tended wounds, and traced the symbols of life into the soil. They were rough, calloused, sometimes trembling with age, and yet she realized they had learned to listen. Not just to the body, but to the breath of the earth itself. As darkness settled, She built a small fire and placed juniper branches upon it. The smoke rose straight and steady into the still air. She spoke softly into the night, her voice low and rhythmic. For the ones who came before me, for the ones who will come after, let this fire remember us all. Her words floated into the air, mingling with the smoke and the scent of the herbs. She thought of Maritima in Rome, her lamp burning beneath the stone city.
That flame had been fragile, trembling against the weight of empire, yet it had survived through women like her, through healers who tended both wounds and soil, through prayers whispered to no one and everyone. The stars began to appear one by one above the horizon. Astrid lay back on the grass, her head resting on her folded cloak. The night air was cool, and the world around her seemed to hum with invisible music. She could feel the heartbeat of the land again, slow and steady beneath her. It pulsed through the roots of trees, through rivers and rocks, through her own veins. Before sleep took her, she whispered one last thought to the earth. Teach me to keep listening. And the wind, soft and kind, brushed her cheek in answer. The fire beside her crackled, gently casting its golden light over her face. Somewhere deep below in the quiet dark, where seeds slept and rivers dreamed, the earth heard her words and promised to remember. The flame that old companion passed from woman to woman, from hand to hand, now glowed in the northern night like a heartbeat shared between worlds. And while Astrid slept, it kept burning steadfast eternal, waiting for the next chapter of its long human journey to begin. The night in the northern valley lingered long, wrapping Astrid in a hush so deep it felt eternal. Her fire burned to embers, her breath mingling with the mist that drifted once again over the earth she had blessed. Somewhere beneath her, the land began to stir the soil. She had listened to the heartbeat she had felt slowly waking from its slumber. The flame had done its work, passing quietly, invisibly into new hands. Far from the northern forests, centuries later, another heart would hear that same whisper of light. It would call not from the earth, but from heaven. And it would awaken a young girl named Jean. In a small French village called Domremy, the world still slept beneath a blanket of mist. It was the kind of dawn that made even the church bell hesitate before breaking the silence. The air smelled of hay smoke and dew. The meadows glistened faintly with the memory of night. In a modest stone cottage, a girl stirred beneath her blanket. Her name was Jeanne, and though she was only a farmer's daughter, there was something within her, something ancient and luminous that did not belong to the ordinary world. She rose quietly, careful not to wake her parents or her brothers. The wooden floor creaked beneath her bare feet as she crossed the room. Outside, the roosters had not yet begun to crow, and the sky was still gray, holding the last stars of the night like tiny prayers. She slipped out the door and into the meadow. The world there was her sanctuary, the whisper of grass, the soft murmur of the river, the distant outline of the village church. She knelt on the damp earth and crossed herself. Her breath formed a small cloud in the cold morning air. "Holy Mother," she whispered, "thank you for the light of this day. Let me serve you in my work and in my heart." Her voice was soft, yet it carried far, as if the air itself leaned closer to listen. Jean was 16, though her face held the calm gravity of someone much older. Life in Domremy was not easy.
The 100 Years' War had turned the land weary, and the stories of suffering reached even this quiet village. But she bore her days with patience. Her faith was her shield, and in it she found beauty where others saw only hardship. She rose and began walking toward the river where the cattle grazed. The mist parted around her like a curtain, and for a moment she felt as though she were walking in another world. The stillness was so complete that even the birds had not yet dared to sing. Then faintly at first she heard it a sound like wind moving through leaves, though there were no trees nearby. It was followed by something clearer, a voice. Gentle, melodic, but unmistakably real. Jean. She froze. The voice came again, soft but resonant like the ringing of a faraway bell. Jean, daughter of Jacques, beloved of God. Her heart thudded in her chest. The world around her seemed to shimmer the grass. The air, even the light itself, changed, becoming warmer, almost golden. She turned slowly, and before her stood a figure surrounded by brilliance. It was not the blinding light of the sun, but the soft radiance of dawn, the kind of glow that fills a chapel before morning mass. The figure spoke again. Do not be afraid. Jean's knees gave way and she fell to the ground. Her breath came quick, her hands shaking. Who are you? She whispered. I am Saint Michael, protector of France, the voice said. I am sent to you by the King of Heaven. The world was utterly still. Jean bowed her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. Saint Michael? He looked upon her with eyes that seemed to hold the reflection of every sky she had ever seen. You have been chosen, Jean, to bear a message and a mission. You will lift the sorrow of your people and restore hope to this land. The Lord has called you to lead his soldiers to raise the banner of faith above the noise of war. She shook her head, trembling. I am no leader. I am no soldier. I am only a girl. Even a girl, the archangel said, can become the voice through which God speaks. The light grew brighter, flooding the meadow. Jean could smell the faint scent of lilies and smoke. The air thrummed with unseen music. Around the archangel, other forms appeared, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, radiant and gentle, their eyes full of compassion. Together they watched her, not as one might watch a child, but as one might regard a candle newly lit in the dark. Do not fear your weakness, Saint Catherine said. It is through weakness that God reveals his strength. Jean's tears fell freely now, though she felt no sorrow. Only awe, only love. The saints spoke to her not as distant beings, but as friends familiar as the voices of her family. The sound of them filled her heart like a tide. When at last the vision faded, the light receding into the gray morning, Jean found herself kneeling alone in the field. The mist had returned, and the world was quiet once more. But the silence was different now. It hummed with meaning, alive with purpose. Her hands still tingled where she had clasped them in prayer. She rose slowly, her breath visible in the cool air, her heart both heavy and burning. she looked toward the distant church spire, its cross faintly glinting in the dawn. The bells began to ring low, steady, solemn. Each note seemed to echo inside her chest. She knew without understanding how that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. That evening, she told no one of what she had seen. She worked beside her mother, milking the cows, fetching water, stirring the stew. But her gaze often drifted to the window, to the fading sky, where the stars would soon appear again. Her heart beat in rhythm with the memory of that voice. She did not yet know the shape of her mission, only that the fire had been lit within her, the same fire that had burned beneath Rome, that had glowed in Astrid's heart, now burning quietly in her own chest. When night fell, she lay awake, the wind brushing softly against the shutters. She whispered into the darkness, "If you are truly calling me, then teach me how to listen." Outside, a single star brightened above the hills, its light steady and clear. Jean watched it until her eyes grew heavy, her heart still whispering its silent prayer.
Somewhere far away beyond time and distance, the eternal flame flickered alive once more in the hands of a young girl who would in time awaken the faith of a nation. For many nights after the first vision, Jean's world seemed to move between two realms, the visible and the invisible. By day, she walked among her family and neighbors, gathering water, tending the cattle, speaking little. By night, she lay awake, her heart alive with a warmth she could neither explain nor escape. The voices returned to her softly at first, like the sound of wind passing through leaves. They came not to frighten her, but to teach her to shape courage from her humility. And so, beneath the quiet sky of Domremy, a girl of 16 began to listen to the language of heaven. The morning broke with a hush, as if the whole world had paused to listen. Jean stepped outside her cottage, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The frost had settled on the fields like powdered glass, and the first rays of the sun touched the church steeple in the distance, turning its cross to gold. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began to walk toward the orchard behind her home. It was her favorite place, the orchard. Even in winter, when the branches were bare, it felt alive, full of whispers and light. As she walked between the rows of trees, her boots crunching against the frozen ground, she thought of the voice she had heard days ago. Saint Michael. The name itself glowed in her thoughts like a candle in darkness. She had not told anyone, not even her mother, for how could she? The words of heaven were not easily spoken aloud. At the edge of the orchard, she knelt beside the old apple tree, the one her father said had stood since before he was born. She placed her hands on its trunk and closed her eyes. If it was real, she whispered, then show me again. Tell me what to do. For a moment there was only silence. The wind brushed her hair cold and tender. She waited, her heart aching with expectation. Then light. It came softly this time, not as blinding as before, but as a warmth that filled the space around her. The air shimmered, and from the light stepped the figures she now knew, Saint Michael, and beside him, two women clothed in radiance, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. Jean bowed her head, tears rising unbidden. Why have you come again? Because your heart has not turned away, said Saint Catherine.
her voice as clear as the chime of crystal. The Lord chooses those who are willing to listen. And you, Jean, have listened. St. Michael spoke, then his tone solemn but kind. The time is near. France is suffering, her people scattered, her king uncertain. You must go to him. Jean looked up, eyes wide. To the Dauphin she breathed. But I am no one. I cannot even ride a horse. How can I speak to a prince? You will not speak as yourself, said St. Margaret, stepping forward. You will speak as the messenger of heaven, and when you do, even the proud will listen. The orchard around them seemed to fade, replaced by a vision that unfolded before Jean's eyes. She saw a battlefield, smoke, mud, and chaos. Soldiers cried out, banners torn the ground, soaked in rain and blood. Yet amidst it all, a light broke through the clouds, a white banner with a golden cross lifting high above the noise. She saw herself there, armor gleaming, her voice rising clear over the din. When the vision faded, she gasped. I don't understand, she said. Why me? I am only a girl. I have no strength. St. Michael knelt before her, then his armor shining with the glow of morning. Strength is not in the arm, Jean, but in the heart that believes. The Lord does not call the powerful, he calls the faithful. Her breath trembled in the cold. But they will laugh at me, she said softly. They will say I am mad. Then let them laugh. St. Catherine said gently, the truth has always been born in the hearts of the small. Yours is the voice through which faith will speak again. For a long while Jean said nothing. The orchard seemed to hold its breath. She could hear the faint creak of branches, the trickle of melting frost. Her heart pounded each beat, echoing with the memory of the battlefield she had just seen. She thought of her village, her family, the cows that grazed by the river, the quiet life she knew. And then she thought of France, wounded, broken, waiting for hope. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. Tell me what to do. The saints smiled. Go to Vaucouleurs, said St. Michael. There you will find Robert de Baudricourt. Ask him to send you to the Dauphin at Chinon. Do not be afraid. We will go before you. Jean felt her hands grow warm as though touched by invisible fire. When must I leave? She asked. When the first buds appear on the apple trees, St. Margaret said. Then you will know the season has come for faith to blossom. The light began to fade, but before it vanished, St. Catherine reached out her hand and touched Jean's forehead. Be patient, Jean. Trust the silence as much as the voice. God speaks in both. And then they were gone. The orchard returned to its quiet self, the frost sparkling under the morning sun. Jeanne sat back against the tree, her heart both heavy and bright. The air felt different now, charged with meaning, alive with promise. For days after, she carried the vision in her like a hidden flame. She continued her work, tending the fields and helping her mother. But every sunrise seemed to whisper, soon. When her father spoke of war, of how the English pushed deeper into France, she felt no fear, only a steady resolve, as if her heart had already stepped into a future she had yet to live. One evening, as she watched the last snow melt from the fields, she saw the first buds bloom on the apple trees. tiny, pale, trembling blossoms. The sight filled her with quiet awe. She fell to her knees in the soft earth and whispered, "It's time." That night, beneath the glow of the hearth, she told her family she would leave. Her father frowned. Her mother wept. Her brothers laughed in disbelief. But Jeanne only smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "The Lord has called me," she said simply. "And when he calls you, do not refuse." Outside, the wind swept gently through the orchard, shaking the branches so that a few petals drifted down onto the roof of their home. In the soft darkness, it almost seemed as though heaven itself had scattered blessings upon her path. And somewhere unseen, the same eternal flame that once burned in a Roman cellar, that glowed in Astrid's hearth, flickered now in Jeanne's heart, steady, fearless, waiting to light the world. When the apple blossoms opened, Jeanne's world changed forever. The voices that had once visited her in silence now guided her every breath. They spoke of courage, of obedience, of faith that burns brighter than fear. She left her home with the dawn, her mother's tears still wet on her cheek, and began the long road to Vaucouleurs. At first, the villagers called her foolish, even mad. Yet her steps did not falter. Each mile carried her closer to the destiny the saints had whispered in her dreams. What began as a journey of one small girl would soon stir the heart of a nation asleep in despair. The wind was sharp that morning, full of the scent of mud and war. Jeanne rode at the front of her small company, her hands gripping the reins tightly, her armor glinting beneath a gray sky. The world around her seemed alive with sound, hooves pounding banners, snapping soldiers, murmuring prayers under their breath. To her right, the Loire River glimmered darkly between the hills. To her left, the distant walls of Orléans rose like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. For weeks she had traveled with the army through rain, hunger, and doubt. Yet the flame within her never dimmed. The voices had grown silent since she left Chinon, but their echo lived inside her heart. Every time fear crept near, she whispered the same words, "God is my strength." It was not courage she felt, but surrender and unshakable trust that she was not walking alone. The soldiers around her still looked upon her with wonder and unease. They called her La Pucelle, the maid, half with reverence and half with disbelief. They had seen her ride into camp clad in white, her banner raised high, a white field adorned with lilies, and at its center, the image of Christ in glory. Some said the sight of her made even the most hardened men fall to their knees. Others whispered that she was a witch. But when she spoke, her voice carried such peace that even the doubters fell silent. That morning, as they neared Orléans, the air trembled with tension. Jeanne dismounted and walked ahead, the banner resting against her shoulder. The city's gates were battered, its people starving, the English soldiers entrenched beyond the river. Smoke hung over the horizon like a wound that would not close. She looked at it, all the broken walls, the cries of the wounded, and felt no fear, only compassion. A commander approached her. His armor dented his beard, streaked with gray. "We are outnumbered, girl," he said, his voice heavy. "The men are weary. If you fail, France falls with you." Jeanne turned to him, her eyes calm and bright. "It is not I who will fail," she said. "It is God who fights for France, and he does not know defeat." He said nothing more. When she turned back to her soldiers, she saw the doubt in their faces, but also something else. Hope faint, but growing. She lifted her banner high, and the wind caught it, spreading it wide against the darkening sky. "Soldiers of France," she called, her voice ringing clear across the field. "You who have prayed for deliverance, who have watched your homes burn and your brothers fall, take heart. God has not forgotten you. The light still lives in us. Today we fight not for glory, but for mercy. For every mother who weeps, for every child who hungers today, we fight for peace." Her words fell like fire into their hearts. The men straightened, gripping their weapons with renewed purpose. A murmur rose among them, swelling into a cry. "For God and France." Jeanne smiled, tears burning behind her eyes. She mounted her horse, raised her banner once more, and spurred forward. The first clash of steel rang out like thunder. Arrows hissed through the air. The smell of smoke and sweat filled her lungs. She rode through it all, her banner gleaming white against the storm. Wherever she passed, men found strength they did not know they possessed. She carried no sword. She carried light. And the light seemed to drive the darkness back. Hours blurred into heartbeats. The English fortifications began to crumble. One by one, the enemy lines broke. At sunset, the French soldiers breached the final barricade. Jeanne rode straight into the chaos, her banner streaming behind her like a river of light. Then came the arrow. It struck her shoulder, piercing through the chainmail. She gasped, the pain sharp and sudden, but she did not fall. Her men cried out, rushing toward her, but she raised her hand. "Do not stop," she shouted. "The battle is the Lord's." She clutched the banner tighter, holding it high, even as her blood stained the fabric. "In his name, onward." The soldiers surged forward, shouting her name. The tide turned, the enemy scattered, and before the moon had risen, the gates of Orléans stood open. The bells of the city rang out wildly, their sound carrying across the valley like a hymn. When the fighting ended, Jean was carried into the city. Her wound was deep, but not fatal. As the physician cleaned it, she looked toward the open window. Outside, the night sky shimmered with stars. The air smelled of victory smoke and prayer. She could hear the people below singing Te Deum in the streets. A young soldier knelt beside her bed. "It is done," he said softly. "You have saved us." Jean smiled faintly. "No," she whispered. "It was never me." Her banner lay folded at her side, still marked with her blood. She touched it gently. "This is not the end," she murmured. "It is only the beginning." For in her heart she knew that the battle was not merely for a city, nor even for France. It was for faith itself, the faith that binds heaven to earth, the courage to believe in light, even when surrounded by darkness. Outside, the bells of Orléans rang through the night. They sounded like the beating of a great heart, steady and eternal. Jeanne closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, the echo of divine purpose still burning in her soul. And somewhere beyond the reach of the stars, the same flame that had burned in the heart of Maritima beneath Rome, and in the hands of Astrid among the northern hills, now blazed within a young girl who dared to believe that God could speak through her. The flame had crossed centuries and kingdoms, but its light had never dimmed. It lived in the courage of a maiden who carried a banner into the storm and changed the world. Long after the bells of Orléans stopped ringing, the echo of victory remained a sound that would outlive the century, whispered through prayer and memory. Jean's white banner had become a symbol of faith, restored, of light rekindled where despair had taken root. Yet time, relentless and patient, carried that same flame forward once more. The girl who had heard the voice of heaven became legend, her courage becoming part of the world's heartbeat. And somewhere far from the battlefields of France, in a quieter age and humbler place, another pair of hands would take up the work of keeping that light alive, not through war, but through bread, fire, and the daily labor of love. The night wind rattled the shutters of a small stone bakery on the edge of a medieval town. Inside, the air glowed gold with firelight. The baker, an old man named Martin, stood before the great oven, its mouth roaring with heat. The scent of flour and smoke filled the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of yeast. Outside, the streets lay quiet under a blanket of snow, but within those walls life hummed softly, the rhythm of kneading, the whisper of rising dough, the sigh of the fire breathing life into loaves. It was well past midnight, yet Martin had been awake since dusk. He had long stopped counting the years he'd done this work. Baking was not merely his trade, it was his prayer. Each loaf to him was a kind of offering, a humble act of creation that fed the bodies and spirits of those who would wake before dawn. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and leaned close to the oven door. The loaves inside were turning golden, now their crusts swelling, their scent warm and human. Behind him, his apprentice stirred sleepily, a boy no older than 12. "Master," the boy mumbled, "why must we rise when the moon does? The town still sleeps. Couldn't the bread wait until morning?" Martin smiled faintly, never taking his eyes from the fire. "Because hunger does not sleep, Tomas," he said, "and neither does grace. The people will come with the dawn, and the bread must be ready before the first church bell." The boy sighed, rubbing his eyes. "But it's so cold." "Yes," Martin said softly, placing another log onto the fire. Sparks leapt upward, glowing like tiny stars before fading into smoke. "But that's why we keep the fire alive. The world is cold enough without our help." He spoke gently, his voice worn smooth by years of patience. In truth, he had no family left, only the boy, the oven, and the quiet company of the bread he baked each night. Yet he never felt lonely. The fire was his companion, its warmth, a steady reminder that life, even in its smallest acts, could be holy. As the hours passed, the room filled with the sound of quiet work. The slap of dough, the creak of wood, the hiss of steam rising from the loaves. Through the small window, Martin could see the stars beginning to fade, the black sky softening to gray. Dawn was coming. He opened the oven door carefully, and the light within spilled out like a sunrise. He lifted each loaf golden and fragrant, setting them on the wooden table to cool. "Listen," he said to Tomas, nodding toward the window. The boy tilted his head. At first he heard nothing. Then, faintly from far off, came the tolling of the church bell, slow, solemn, and sweet. The first Mass of the day. Martin smiled. There it is. The sound of God's heartbeat. The boy looked puzzled. A bell. Martin chuckled softly. Yes, a bell. And bread. And fire. These are the ways he speaks when we are too weary to listen.
He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him toward the table. Together, they began to arrange the loaves into baskets lined with linen. The bread still steamed, filling the air with warmth. The boy's small hands worked clumsily but with care. Martin watched him, remembering his own youth when he too had learned this sacred rhythm from another old man who had since returned to God. "When I was your age," he said quietly, "my master told me something I've never forgotten. He said that every loaf of bread carries two miracles, the one that feeds the body and the one that reminds us we are not alone." Tomas looked up. "Do you believe that?" Martin smiled. "Every day." Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow and silent. A faint light touched the horizon, the color of pale honey. The boy carried the first basket to the door, his breath misting in the cold. Martin followed, his old hands steady despite the chill. They stepped out into the street. The world was hushed, save for the whisper of falling snow and the distant singing of monks greeting the dawn. They began their walk through the village, leaving small footprints in the white powder. One by one they delivered the bread to the widow who lived alone by the well, to the poor family with the broken roof, to the priest preparing for morning mass. With each loaf given, Martin murmured a blessing. "May this fire keep you warm." By the time the sun rose, the baskets were empty. The boy's cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes shone with pride. "Master," he said, "everyone in town eats your bread. Doesn't that make you happy?" Martin smiled, the lines of his face deepening. "It does, but not for the reason you think. What makes me happiest, Tomas, is that the bread lives only for a moment. It is made to disappear, to be broken, shared, and gone. Yet every morning we begin again. That is the secret of grace." They returned to the bakery where the oven's warmth welcomed them like an embrace. Martin knelt before the fire, adding one last piece of wood. He whispered a prayer too soft for the boy to hear. It was not a prayer for wealth or comfort, but for continuity, for the flame to never die, for the hands that followed his, to keep the fire alive long after he was gone. As the sun climbed higher, the light poured through the bakery window, turning the dust in the air to gold. The smell of bread lingered warm and pure. The boy dozed in a chair, his head nodding. Martin smiled faintly, watching him, knowing that soon it would be his turn to teach another, just as the flame had passed from Maritima to Astrid, from Jean to the countless souls who came after. Outside, the church bells rang again, and the sound mingled with the soft crackle of the fire. Martin closed his eyes, resting his palms against his knees. "Thank you," he whispered, "for fire, for bread, for the chance to keep your warmth alive." And in that moment, as the golden light filled the room, it seemed that heaven itself smiled back through the rising steam,
the same eternal warmth that had once burned in the hearts of saints and dreamers, now alive in a baker's humble hands. As the morning light filled the small bakery, its warmth mingled with the scent of fresh bread and the slow, steady crackle of fire. Outside, the snow melted in soft patches beneath the rising sun, and the streets began to stir with life. Martin's hands, rough and dusted with flour, rested on the wooden table beside the cooling loaves. He could feel the heat radiating through the crust, the breath of the bread itself, a warmth born of patience, labor, and faith. For him, every loaf was more than sustenance. It was a prayer offered to the world. And yet, beyond the quiet comfort of his hearth, the meaning of that prayer stretched far beyond bread or fire. It reached into the mystery of the sacred, where even the simplest acts of man became the language of God. The church bells rang for morning mass, their tones slow and tender echoing through the narrow streets of the village. Martin lifted his head, wiping the flour from his hands, and listened. The bells always carried him back to his youth, to days when his mother would take his small hand in hers and lead him to the chapel, whispering prayers as they walked. Even now, after so many winters, he felt the same stirring in his chest whenever the bells called out the reminder that every day began and ended in gratitude. Tomas the boy stirred from sleep on the bench near the oven. The firelight touched his face, painting his cheeks in gold. He blinked, yawning, and looked toward the door. "Master," he said softly, "shall we go to Mass?" Martin smiled. "Yes, lad. Let the loaves rest, and let us do the same." They stepped outside the chill of morning, kissing their faces. The snow had turned to slush beneath the sun glistening in the streets. Villagers passed them on their way to the church baskets in hand candles wrapped in cloth. The smell of incense drifted faintly through the open doors ahead, mingling with the lingering scent of bread on Martin's clothes. He felt at peace, humble content, as though the world itself were pausing for a breath of prayer. Inside the church was dim and beautiful. Candles lined the altar, their flames trembling in the draught. The air was thick with the perfume of myrrh and beeswax. Martin and Tomas knelt in the back pew, heads bowed. The priest's voice rose solemn and tender, speaking of the mystery of faith, the same mystery Martin lived each day in his bakery, though he had never put it into words. When the moment of consecration came, the priest lifted the host high above his head, and the light from the stained glass windows fell upon it like the touch of heaven itself. Martin felt his throat tighten. The bread in the priest's hands was not so different from the loaves he baked it to, had been formed by human hands, mixed with water and salt, brought to life by fire. But here, before the altar, it became something beyond nourishment. It became presence, the unseen, eternal, infinite love of God, taking shape in something small enough to fit in the palm of one's hand. Tomas leaned close to whisper, "Master, do you think it's truly him inside the bread?" Martin looked at the boy and smiled, his eyes gentle. "Yes, Tomas. I believe he hides there because he knows how to be small, because love must become simple to be shared." The boy nodded, though his brow furrowed with wonder. Martin's gaze returned to the altar where the priest broke the bread in two. The sound was soft, but in that silence it echoed through Martin's heart like thunder.
He thought of the long nights by the oven of hands, kneading dough until they trembled, of the people who came each morning to buy a loaf with their few remaining coins. How many times had he seen hunger in their eyes, not only for food, but for dignity, for warmth, for hope. When Mass ended, he lingered near the altar as the others filed out. The priest approached him, smiling kindly. "Your bread fills the whole town with its fragrance," the priest said. "Even the poorest among us taste God's goodness through your work." Martin lowered his head. "It is not my work, Father. I only tend the fire." The priest's eyes softened. "That is the holiest work of all." Later, as Martin and Tomas walked home through the streets, the boy carried a small piece of blessed bread wrapped in cloth. "Do you think Tomas asked that what we bake is holy too?" Martin nodded slowly. "Every loaf is holy if it is made with love." When we work with care, when we share what we have, we take part in the same mystery that happens on the altar. The difference is only the words, but the heart is the same. The boy fell silent, holding that thought as carefully as the bread in his hands. Back in the bakery, the fire had dimmed its embers glowing red beneath a veil of ash. Martin knelt beside it, stirring the coals with the iron rod. The flames leapt up again, golden and alive. He stared into them for a long time, feeling the warmth on his face. In their dance, he saw the shape of the stories he had heard as a boy. The woman who prayed to Venus beneath Rome, the healer who spoke to herbs in the northern mist, the maiden who carried God's banner through the storm. He did not know their names, but he knew their spirit. Each of them had kept the light alive in their own way, and now, in this quiet little bakery, that same light burned still. He rose, placed another log into the oven, and set his hands once more to the dough. Tomas joined him, pressing his small palms into the flour with care. "Why do we bless the bread before we bake it?" the boy asked. Martin smiled. "Because bread remembers what we forget. It teaches us that life must rise before it is shared." The sun climbed higher, filling the bakery with gold. The loaves baked slowly, their scent drifting out into the street. Villagers passing by smiled and waved, their faces softened by the warmth that came from within those walls. By midday, the baskets were full again. Martin stood at the door looking out at the people gathering in the square, and felt the same quiet joy that came every time the bread was ready. He turned to the boy and said softly, "Each loaf we give feeds the body, but it also feeds faith, Tomas. The two are never far apart." The boy looked up at him, smiling through the flour on his cheeks. "Then we'll never stop baking," he said. Martin laughed, the sound deep and kind. "No, lad. We'll keep the fire alive until it's someone else's turn to tend it." And as he spoke, the bell in the church tower began to toll once more. Its echo rolled over the rooftops, through the streets, and into the hearts of all who heard it. It was not just the sound of time passing. It was the sound of faith itself, rising and falling like breath, reminding them that God's grace could live in flour and fire and in the steady hands of those who loved enough to give.
The bell in the church tower continued to toll through the quiet air, its final notes melting into the hum of life in the village square. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the streets, mingling with the laughter of children and the faint hymn rising from the chapel. Inside the small bakery, the fire glowed low but steady, the same flame that had endured countless dawns and countless hands. Martin stood at the window watching Thomas hand a loaf to a woman wrapped in a wool shawl, and something inside him felt complete. The rhythm of giving, of tending, of quiet faith had not been broken. And as the world turned beyond his humble town, the story of the flame continued passing again from one generation to another until it no longer belonged to any single person, but to all of humanity. Winter melted into spring, and with it came the soft greening of the fields, the slow return of birds, and the gentle thaw of frozen rivers. The world seemed to exhale relieved. In the little village, Martin's bakery woke each morning before sunrise, its windows glowing gold while the rest of the town still dreamed. Thomas, now taller and surer, had taken over the heavy work. His laughter filled the shop as he kneaded the dough with youthful strength, while Martin's hands, though slower, shaped each loaf with reverence. Between them, the fire never died. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, Martin would sit by the oven and think of all who had come before the unseen keepers of warmth, whose stories had been carried by the same light that now flickered in his heart. He thought of the woman in Rome who had guarded her small oil lamp beneath the noise of empire, of Astrid, the healer who spoke with the earth and learned that every living thing carried a memory of the divine, of Jean, whose faith had turned war into prayer, and of the countless others whose names were forgotten, but whose courage still glowed in the breath of the world. He understood now that none of them were ever alone. The flame had always moved quietly, hand to hand, heart to heart across centuries, and lands changing its form, but never its purpose. It was in the lamps of the humble, in the prayers of the weary, in the bread broken by the poor. It was the light that refused to die, the fire of endurance, of hope, of love. On one particularly calm evening, when the sun slipped low and the village was wrapped in the amber hush of twilight, Martin took Thomas to the hill overlooking the fields. The air was soft, scented with the smoke of hearths and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers. Below them, the rooftops glowed with the last touch of light. "Do you see that?" Martin asked quietly, pointing to the horizon. Thomas nodded. "The sunset." "Yes," Martin said, "but also, what comes after? The light goes, but the warmth stays. It hides inside the earth, waiting to rise again. The world is full of endings that are only beginnings." The boy looked at him with thoughtful eyes. Like the bread, he said, "We break it, and it's gone, but it feeds everyone." Martin smiled, a deep, quiet smile that came from the place where gratitude and peace meet. "Exactly that." They stood in silence for a while, watching the colors fade from the sky. The first stars appeared fragile and steady. Martin's breath came slower these days. The years had gathered on his shoulders like snow, but his eyes still held the spark of a younger man. He turned to Thomas. "When I am gone, promise me one thing," he said. The boy frowned. "Don't talk like that. I must," Martin said gently. "Promise me you'll keep the fire alive." Not just this one. He gestured toward the village where smoke rose from their chimney, but the one that lives here. He placed a hand over the boy's chest. The one that listens, that gives, that forgives. Tomas swallowed hard, his voice small. I promise. Martin nodded, satisfied. Then the world will never be dark. That night, back in the bakery, Martin sat alone for a while as Tomas cleaned up. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows on the walls. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind outside, to the faint creak of the beams, to the heartbeat of the fire itself. It spoke to him without words, the same language it had spoken to all who came before. Keep going. Keep giving. The light lives in you. He smiled, whispering a simple prayer. Thank you for letting me be part of the chain.
The days that followed came and went in quiet rhythm. Spring deepened into summer. The bakery thrived, and Tomas's laughter filled every corner. One morning he awoke early and found Martin still by the oven, his hands folded, his face peaceful. The fire beside him glowed low, but alive. Tomas knelt there for a long time, tears falling silently before he rose and added wood to the flame. It caught immediately, burning bright once more. Years later, people would say that the boy who became a man baked with a light that could not be explained. His loaves carried warmth even after they cooled, and those who ate them swore they felt comforted as if some hidden blessing lived inside the crust. Tomas never spoke of it. He only smiled when people asked and said, "It's the fire. It remembers." And perhaps it did. For somewhere beyond time, the flame that began beneath the stones of Rome still flickered through ages, through hands, through faith. It glowed in the healer's hearth in the north, in the banner carried by the maiden of France, in the oven of a humble baker who prayed over his bread, and in every small act of kindness that kept the world from freezing over. The flame was not a thing to be owned, but to be carried. To pass it on was to live forever in the hearts of others. And so it continued through every generation that dared to love, to forgive, to create, to hope. It burned quietly, unseen by the proud, but cherished by the simple. It was the whisper in the silence, the warmth in the cold, the golden thread that bound humanity to heaven. As the story closes, the light does not end. Somewhere tonight, in a room dimly lit by a single candle, someone kneels and prays. Someone tends a fire. Someone lifts a piece of bread and gives thanks. And in that moment, the world glows again, because the hands that kept the flame are still at work.